Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Abayomi Says. Hello, everyone. I am Mr. Abayomi. Thanks for tuning back in. If you like the content, please hit like and subscribe below. This is part one on the discussion of monuments and some of the controversy surrounding them. Our country seems to have an affinity for erecting monuments, naming military bases after slaveholders along with treasonous Confederate generals. Camp Beauregard, Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Gordon, Fort A.P. Hill, Fort Hood, Fort Lee, Fort Pickett, Fort Polk, Fort Rucker, Camp Maxey, and Camp Pendleton. The naming of monuments after presidents, in particular the Founding Fathers, can be a bit tricky. Let me explain. 10 out of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are always mentioned first. One would assume they were POTUS number 1 and POTUS number 2. In fact, they were POTUS number 1 and POTUS number 3. They were both slaveholders. At their combined peak, they oversaw the chattel enslavement of over 900 people of African descent. There is the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial, both located in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. George Washington's estate of Mount Vernon is located 17 miles south of D.C. in Mount Vernon, Virginia, and is run by the National Park Service. Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's estate, is located 116 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. in Charlottesville, Virginia. John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the first vice president and the second president of the United States, an anti-slavery proponent, both socially and politically, who never owned any slaves, has no monument or statue in the nation's capital. I am not suggesting that every former president should have a monument or statue in the nation's capital. I do want to point out that there is a very large statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Square across the street from the White House. POTUS number 7 was pro-slavery, pro-Western expansion for slavery, and had a high dislike of Native Americans. Under Jackson's administration, we saw the Indian Removal Act, culminating in the Trail of Tears. These were policies during Jackson's 2 terms as president, which forced the relocations of tens of thousands of Native Americans. Over 4,000 died as they walked 1,000 miles on foot from the east coast of the United States into what was considered Indian territory then, currently Oklahoma. The point I'm making is, people were quick to point out how great these men were. In particular, Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson. The fact is, these 3 men had some major character flaws. By today's standards, they would all be considered white supremacists, and we honor these men with statues and memorials. The goal here is not to try and change the narrative, but to tell the whole story of who these men were. If we want to live in a better and more inclusive society, we need to do a better job of showing a larger swath of the social and political environment of the times when it comes to who we glorified as our country's heroes, and tell a more complete story about the various people who helped mold this country. George Washington freeing his slaves in his will is not entirely accurate. William Lee was the only enslaved person freed upon Washington's death. Washington owned 123 slaves upon his death. His wife owned 153 she inherited through her first marriage, and brought with her 84. Chattel slavery was a business as well. George Washington inherited 10 slaves when his father died when he was 11, purchased at least 8 more before marrying his wife Martha Custis. President Washington's slaves were to remain in bondage until Martha Washington's death. She freed her late husband's slaves a year later because she became paranoid they were trying to revolt against her. She never freed any of her own slaves. The rest of the slaves that she owned from her previous marriage were actually willed to her children. George Washington also signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This will conclude part 1. I will continue this conversation in part 2. Be well, be safe, God bless, and I bid you peace.